and a warm welcome to the latest edition of Conversations in Drug Development, brought to you by the team at Boyd's. This podcast is for our fellow community of scientists and clinicians working in the wonderful world of cell and gene therapy and drug development. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy the conversation.
Hello and welcome to another instalment of Conversations in Drug Development. I am your host for today's episode, Harriet Edwards, part of the regulatory team here at Boyd's, and I'm delighted to be joined by not one but two guests today, two of our regulatory affairs team, one who is a familiar member of the podcast team, Dr. Katherine Bowen.
Hello
and welcome. And also Shalini Gupta, pleased to welcome you for the first time, our Senior Manager of Regulatory Affairs here at Boyd's.
Hello, nice to be here.
It's excellent to have you both here, and I'm really pleased with the topic that we're going to be discussing today. It's a regulatory affairs topic, unsurprisingly, and we're going to be focusing very much on the EU and some legislation changes. But don't worry, it's all very interesting. There's a lot going on in the EU at the moment with regards to clinical trials. So we're going to be talking about the Clinical Trials Regulation, also known as the CTR. So I'm very excited to have you both here to talk about that with me today. Before we jump into the CTR, though, I think, Katherine, it's probably worth starting with some background and some history on the environment of clinical trials in the EU, because for those people maybe listening that haven't worked in the EU in clinical trials to date, or maybe those that are new to regulatory affairs, there is some significant changes to where we are today, isn't there?
Yeah, that's a great place to start, I think. I always seem to get the history lesson, which is ironic considering I hated history at school. But anyway, yeah. So in order to put everything we discussed today into context, it's probably important to understand where we came from. So if we go back to, say, the back end of last millennium, last century, which seems like a very long time ago now, clinical trials in Europe were completely regulated at local national competent authority level. It's really important to say that Europe is not one country.
No,
it
absolutely.
is lots of countries. We're at,
contrary to popular belief.
We're at 27 member states at the moment. Actually don't know how many we were at the end of last century. So there was a huge heterogeneity in the requirements across countries and regions, and that was recognised to some extent. So in 2001, the Clinical Trials Directive, which many of our listeners are probably familiar with, was passed. Now, Harriet's geeky regulatory question for you. What is the problem with the directive?
Well, the directive is transposed into national law, isn't it? So given that we have many member states all interpreting things slightly differently, it means that we have somewhat of a discordance between our member states and how they interpret clinical trials regulation or directive, I should say.
Yeah, and that was the problem. So the Clinical Trial Directive was implemented into local law by 2004. And although it was a great start in terms of starting to put some guardrails around how clinical trials should be regulated in Europe, we did end up with some peculiar local level foibles, some variation in timelines, whether or not there were clock stops, document requirements, what was a substantial amendment, what was an IMP, all kinds of things. And of course, we were still doing submissions country by country. So if you think about a large scale phase 3 study where you're going to most of the EU, you feel like you spend literally years submitting applications to competent authorities and also to ethics committees, and then responding piecemeal to all of their questions. So I think there was a recognition that doing clinical trials in Europe was expensive and complicated,
I think
particularly for people from the US, for example. So some efforts were made to try and harmonise everything. So in 2009, we got the voluntary harmonisation procedure, which, as you probably guessed from the name, was voluntary, which tried to coordinate multinational clinical trials and to at least coordinate the questions that came from competent authorities. And I think it's fair to say people have variable experiences of that process. And I think you didn't find it as useful as maybe I did, Harriet.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair to say. Certainly in the early phase clinical trials where you had maybe one or two or just a couple of countries, getting involved in a voluntary harmonisation procedure was quite cumbersome, actually, and not that beneficial. But I can see for the later phases, as with your experience, Katherine, it would have been useful at that point.
Yeah, and I was quite a proponent of it. If you're doing a massive phase 3 programme and you spend your life responding to questions, it did feel like a step forwards. But there was a recognition that there needed to be something more formal put in place. And that brings us to the clinical trial regulation itself.
Very nicely brings us to the clinical trial regulation, Katherine. Thank you for that overview. A whistle-stop tour through clinical trials regulations and legislation over recent years. But We're arriving at the clinical trials regulation, and that is significantly different, as we will discuss over the course of the podcast today. Let's start then with the main objectives of the regulation and moving from the voluntary harmonisation procedure into something a little bit more concrete. What are the main objectives of this regulation?
Yes, there were three main objectives to the CTR, and they were really based around trying to create an environment that was conducive for conducting clinical trials in the EU. So the first one was to get to a greater level of harmonisation across the EU, to increase provisions around clinical trial transparency, and also to ensure the higher standards of patient safety. And in order to achieve all of those, we are talking about a regulation here. So without that necessity to transpose it into local law that kind of tripped us up a bit with the directive. And all of those are incredibly laudable aims, but actually surprisingly difficult to achieve. And I think you have to put into the context of the environment that we were in. So there was an initial public consultation on the clinical trial regulation back in 2011. Took a year or so to get a draft together off the basis of that. And actually the text wasn't approved until 2014. And if you think about this, you've got all of those stakeholders, all of those competent authorities, ethics committees, all with their own ideas around how trials should be regulated, countries with different standard of care, different healthcare systems. You've got academia who just want to be able to run trials simply. This is on a backdrop of huge concerns about potential issues with data transparency in the pharmaceutical industry, the era of Ben Goldacre, bad pharma book, if anyone remembers that. But industry being genuinely concerned about the ability to protect their confidential data. So there was a huge amount of work went into actually pulling together everything that is in the regulation that's published today.
Yeah, and as you said, I think it's understandable when you think about how many different stakeholders and how many different opposing opinions and considerations each of them have. It is really unsurprising that it's taken us the time that it has to get to the point we are today. But in terms of the aims of the regulation, all, as you said, sound very promising, putting patient safety first, et cetera, and great if it works. But what does it actually mean practically for the people that need to take on board this regulation and start using it in the conduct of clinical trials across the EU?
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to give you the high level what's in it view, and then I think Shalini can tell you what the actual practical experience is of it. But let's start with that high level view. So probably the biggest and most significant change is that there is now a single submission made for a multinational clinical trial, and that goes through the Clinical Trial Information System, which is this one-stop shop for all things clinical trials. It's where your submissions are made, your notifications, your amendments. It's where your feedback from regulators and competent authorities is uploaded. It is a behemoth of a system. And that's one of the reasons that this CTR took so long to implement, because although the legislation was passed in 2014, actually CETA's voluntary use didn't come in until 2022 and mandatory use didn't happen until January 2023. And actually we still have trials operating under the CTD. They do all have to be transitioned by the end of January next year. So the clock is ticking for that, which I think we'll probably come back to. But the other key thing was really, it did put some really strict timelines in place around assessment, which to some extent is a bit of a double-edged sword because it works on both sides, right? I mean, it's that the regulators and the ethics committees have to review in certain timelines, but also sponsors do have to respond. And I think we'll come back to that a bit later as well.
Yeah, and it's a really good point. I mean, as if those two massive things weren't, significantly different enough, there are some other key differences as well, aren't there, Katherine?
Yeah, and we've formalised the idea of Part 1 and Part 2 documents, with Part 1 being, I guess, what we would have traditionally thought of as our core regulatory package, the protocol, IMPD, investigator brochure, etc., and Part 2 documents being those local level patient-facing documents, and the idea that there would be a coordinated review across Part 1 and a single opinion provided per country that's applicable for competent authorities and ethics committees. There's also increased transparency provisions, which Shalini will talk through, because that's been a bit of a movable feast over time, and additional safety requirements. But it also brought in this concept of a reporting member state. Because everything's now coordinated, of course, someone has to take responsibility for that. So we now have the reporting member state at the centre of that, who coordinates everything, with these member states concerned would be the other member states who are participating in the clinical trial.
Now, that is really quite different, isn't it, from where we were? I think that's probably an understatement for me to even say it's quite different. It's significantly different. And I wonder whether that means we're moving towards more of an IND-like system that we see in the US, where there is this cradle-to-grave approach. You have consistency with your project managers in the FDA review divisions throughout development. Is that going to be the same thing here? Is that the idea? Or are we just having an RMS per CTA application and we'll see how we go?
You know how I feel about this, because I love more consistency through review in Europe. So sponsors can request their RMS, and we are seeing evidence that there are particular agencies who are doing the majority of those RMS roles at the moment. So I can see a situation whereby companies may use a particular RMS for their phase 2 and ask for them again through phase 3 to try and build that relationship. There is no evidence at the moment that that would feed through into the MAA process, right, for example, and your rapporteurship. Now, whether it will develop in that direction over time, I guess that's possible. But at the moment, there's no evidence that that is indeed the case.
And as you said, at the moment, there's no evidence, but we are still very much in an interim implementation period. It's still quite new. So maybe watch this space and see what happens. But I think given the significant challenges, the differences that we've discussed so far from what we had under CTD and where we are now with CTR, some of those significant differences, it's unfair of me to ask you, Shalini, whether or not this regulation has impacted clinical research, because it would it would be really surprising if it hasn't. So my question to you is, how has the regulation impacted clinical research in the EU so far? And maybe you could give us some highlights on that.
Yeah, definitely. So the regulation has truly transformed the way the clinical trials are being conducted in the EU. So I'll talk about the numbers here. Because of the streamlined process, the trial authorization has been drastically improved over time. As per the report from EU EEA, from the EMA, as of May 2024, there are over 5,000 trials submitted, and out of that, over 3,000 trials have been authorized. So
Wow.
you can see the number. And if you talk about month by month breakup, right when it was mandated in January last year, it was just 76 submissions. And now, as of May, can you guess how many?
Oh, I don't know, maybe double?
Well, it is 500
Wow.
submissions in average.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So that's one. And it's not just about numbers. So one of the main aim was with CTR is access for the information that is all real time, really. And also the transparency has been a real game changer, which enables stakeholders, right from the researchers to patient, to stay informed what is happening in the latest development and findings in the clinical research. And from the sponsor's perspective, it's not, obviously transparency has been a big change. But what has helped sponsor for any multinational trial, it has really facilitated that. Because, for example, if you have rare disease area, you cannot find enough patients in one single country. So you can go for multinational. And with this efficient process, it has really helped the sponsors. So overall, my experience is it has been really a positive step forward, which has made research in EU a bit more transparent, efficient, and safe, as well as promoting innovation.
Well, that's really positive. With any kind of major changes to legislation, it's always a worry as to how they're going to be implemented. But that certainly sounds very positive. And I really like the sound of the real-time access to information, because I think that's incredibly important, not just for sponsors, but for regulators that need to be able to make informed decisions. And of course, for patients who ultimately we're doing the clinical research to support. So I guess my next follow-on question for that would be, how has the regulation, if at all, impacted patients? Because even just the sound of the access to information in better time sounds positive. But are there any other benefits?
Absolutely. For the patient, this regulation has really kept them in mind, really. So what they did is they have enhanced the safety standards, which means that patients in clinical trials are much more safer than ever before, a lot more transparent. We talked about that, which means that is promotes trust and accountability.
Yeah.
Right. And then with the change in CTR process, there has been really improvement in the informed consent process. That means a patient can really understand and make their informed decision whether to participate in particular trial or not. And what's most important in my view was with CTR, there is a provision that patient can now actually be involved in the trial designing, which makes trials much more relevant for the patient. So it's a big step forward for everyone involved.
Absolutely. And I think we can't not underscore how important this regulation is when, implemented properly and to its full extent, how important it will be to patients, which is ultimately the goal, isn't it? But I think it's fair to say that there have been some challenges with implementation. Something this massive, such a big an overhaul of legislation across a continent. We said at the beginning, people often think of the EU as one country. Of course, it is not. So to implement something so massive and for it to take so long, there, of course, has been challenges, hasn't there, Shalini? So maybe give us the sort of top level challenges that we've seen to date and we've experienced.
Yeah, there were several challenges with the implementation itself for sponsors and member states. So they really needed to prepare with this new system, incorporate some processes and system, and obviously trainings. Lot to think about, right? With this big change. And what stands out for me is a shorter response time for the RFIs, request for information, just 10 calendar days for validation phase and 12 calendar days for the assessment phase. And on top of that, the notification needs to be checked in CTIS. So that's a big change here.
Yeah, I think that's definitely worth noting. I know, Katherine, you mentioned it earlier as well about the response times. It is a double-edged sword, isn't it? And it's something significantly different to what we were used to before.
Yeah, it is. I mean, companies weren't very happy spending months and months and months responding to questions. They are equally unhappy about getting them all in a very, very tight turnaround period, particularly if there's a requirement to update documents, your protocol, for example, during that time. And it is tight and it is difficult. I think we're all just going to have to get used to doing it and do a really good job on our documents first time.
Yeah.
So that we're not having to scurry around doing all of this in a really, really short turnaround time.
Absolutely. I think worth noting that plan for success at the beginning and hopefully mitigate against questions that are received, because the ones that are received, we have a really short time to respond to. So, I mean, they're challenges enough, Shalini, but there's a few others that are probably worth noting as well, isn't there?
Yeah, some of them. For example, there's a lack of standardization. For some of there are bits that still need standardization. For example, regarding fees, patient-facing materials, and Part 2 application content, there are differences among member states, what they need really. And the major one, I would say, we have talked about transparency. So it has been really a big challenge for the sponsors to really understand how to balance the transparency standard at the same time as protecting their confidential information as well as the patient data.
Yeah, absolutely. Data. This transparency and CTR, they seem to be always in the same sentence, don't they? And I think it's fair to say that, it's a huge consideration, one of the biggest ones and one of the biggest challenges as well. So maybe let's just elaborate on that a little bit further. What are the problems, or what were the problems, I guess I should say, with the initial transparency requirements that came under CTR?
Yeah, well, when this CTI was launched, there was a transparency requirements which were quite complex in practice. There was also issue with deferral mechanism because it was really difficult to understand whether the deferral can be applied at the same time as redaction. So there were a lot of confusion around that. And literally everything in CTIS was supposed to be published as per the older rules. And with that means is there could be some delay in publication of crucial documents, and which beats the purpose of transparency for the patient. As well as there were some technical hurdles such as document size, some limitation on that, notification not received on time. But the good news is that we have now got the revised transparency rules following the consultation from public to address some of these challenges.
Yeah, and I think it's really worth noting that there have been some updates to transparency. I certainly remember the days where the deferral was just a tick box exercise to particularly early phase clinical trials, where it was like, well, we don't want anyone to know what we're doing for the next 7 years, so let's just not tell them and we can tick that deferral mechanism. So there were a lot of changes that needed to be made, rightly so, to balance the need for protection of confidential information, but also being able to access that critical information that people need around clinical trials, both patients and regulators. So what's happened since those revised rules? What's the main benefits or enhancements that those revised transparency rules bring?
Yeah, with the revised transparency rules, we have only key documents of interest for the public, which are supposed to be published now. So very limited. What that means for sponsor is less redaction work. So that means less
That's good
resources
news.
needed. And then major one is the removal of deferral functionality, which means the patient can access the documents much earlier than before. With this all changes, there's still the provision of redaction of documents. So that's good news for sponsor.
Definitely sounds like much needed update, I think, and maybe a little bit more pragmatic than where we were at before. In terms of other challenges, I think it would be really remiss of me not to mention CETIS. I mean, Katherine, you talked about it right at the beginning as this one-stop shop, this massive thing. It's not just an IT system. It underpins how we actually enforce the regulation, doesn't it? It's huge. So, of course, it's unsurprising that there's going to be technical challenges encountered with the use of CETIS. And one of the reasons why we've seen the implementation of CTR take so long, actually, isn't it, Shalini?
Yeah, so numerous technical problems reported, such as issue with the answering RFIs, no access to uploaded documents, to name a few here. But I would commend efforts from service desk from EMA that has been really positively received.
Yeah, and I think we should just stop for a second to give some kudos to the EMA for the quality of their training materials on using CETIS as well. And I do think they've done an exceptional job on making sure that people have got the best information available on how to use the system.
I think that's a really, really fair point, Katherine. And as we've said, this is not a small undertaking to implement something so massive, and for the regulators as well to get on board with it. You know, it's been really tricky, but I think the collaboration has definitely been there. So thanks for mentioning that. We're talking about CETIS here in terms of challenges with initial uploads and the initial CTA applications. But of course, things do not stay the same as we move through clinical trials. People change their mind, things change as responding to emerging safety data, etc., etc. There's often changes to clinical trial documentation. So are there any challenges with changing documentation throughout the course of the clinical trial, Shalini, or is this challenge that we see with CETIS just at the beginning?
So there are challenges with the managing modifications. Overlapping submissions are not allowed, with some exception. For example, their Part 2 documents for 2 different member states can be possible, but other than that, it's a system rigidity. But that's for a reason, because we don't want to have several versions going on in the system.
Mm-hmm. So definitely some careful planning needed, I think, for managing clinical trials. And of course, we're not turning off the CTD, the directive, one day and asking everybody the following day to comply with the clinical trials regulation. There is this transition period. We've mentioned it earlier. It's very timely, actually. We're talking about it today, I think, with it looming. But what's happening for sponsors that maybe started their clinical trials under CTD and now they're going to be expected to transition to CTR and the regulations that follow with that?
It has been tricky for sponsors, particularly for multinational trial, because they needed to have some suitable submission window when they can actually submit the transition application, as well as harmonizing key documents across the different member state. And post-transition, you need to align entire dossier as per the CTR.
So again, quite a lot of planning and coordination I think we need. Is there a suggested timeline for this transition, Shalini?
Recommended submission no later than October the 16th of this year.
And I would say that there have been some scary numbers bandied around about how many trials have still yet to be transitioned. So just a little word to any of you listening to this who have not yet transitioned your trials from CTD to CTR. You may wish to crack on with that.
And I think there is lots of information going around the transition. What actually happens if, like you say, Katherine, there's a scary number of transitions that haven't been done yet and not that much time left? What is going to happen if we don't transition in time, Shalini?
So practically there will be no status of that trial if that doesn't transition by 30th of January 2025. So there are some penalties and liabilities for the sponsors to be aware of as per different articles in CTR. So watch out for that.
Okay. So I think that the key message here is we don't want anybody to be liable in any way for their trials to be non-compliant. So certainly the transition is important, should be planned for. Let's not end there. That's a bit of a scary point to end. So let's look ahead a little bit further and talk about what the future might look like for clinical trials in the EU. Katherine, is there anything else we need to be aware of?
Yeah, and I think the first thing to say is this has been a massive change in the way in which we conduct trials in Europe. So there's still quite a long way to go, I think, in us all embracing it and just getting the hang of how it all works. But again, kudos to the EU. I do think they are trying really hard to continue to build on what we've seen with the CTR. So there is an initiative called the Accelerating Clinical Trials in the EU, or the ACT EU, which is really looking at ways to foster innovation and collaboration across all of the various stakeholders. And on a very practical level, we've seen some great things coming out of them. They've got a pilot at the moment for combined scientific advice from the Scientific Advice Working Party and the Clinical Trials Facilitation Group to try and bridge that CTA-MAA gap that I whinge on about all the time. And also the potential for scientific advice specifically on CTAs going through CTR, including resubmissions if you've had a rejection. So really practical ways they're going to be helping people. But I just think there's so much still to do, and just us all getting the hang of doing this well and getting our transitions in time.
Yeah, I mean, we keep coming back to that point. But certainly in terms of future prospects, I think we've started something relatively positive within the EU. Let's hope that if it's all implemented well and people do get on board with it, there is this effort from industry as well as from the regulators to really make this work and make the EU an attractive place for clinical trials. So I think overall a positive note to end on. We've covered an awful lot today, as we always do in these podcasts. It's always a whistle-stop tour through what could be, I think, a series, actually, of podcasts, particularly on this topic. But if I was to ask you both what the main take-home messages are, I think I can probably already guess yours, Katherine. But maybe if I come to you, Shalini, for your take-home messages, and then we'll go to Katherine to close out.
Yeah, so CTR, despite the challenges, we have talked a lot about its implementation, but it has been overall positively received by everyone in this field. For transition, I would recommend sponsor act now rather than waiting for the deadline. Yeah,
and I think, I would second that from Shalini. And I do also agree. And I think, yes, this has had its challenges, but I think this is such a great step forwards for trying to bring some real harmonisation across EU. I do want to recognise that the quality of the training I mentioned earlier, but also the adaptability, the fact that the issues with the transparency rules were recognised and acted upon. There were also changes in the requirements for transitional trials to try and make it a bit simpler for companies to do all of this. So I think this is all such a positive step forwards for continuing to make Europe an amazing place in which to do clinical trials, but for all the stakeholders, including, most importantly, patients living with diseases across the EU.
And that is ultimately what this whole industry is about. That's why we all come to work, isn't it? We want to make the world a better place for patients who need medicines that don't currently have access to them. So a really nice way to end the podcast today, I think, Katherine. Thanks for that final note. It's been wonderful to have you both on the podcast. It's been really fascinating. And I think we'll probably revisit this topic again in the not too distant future to see what's changed post-transition. But for now, Shalini, Katherine, thank you so much for being a guest on today's podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us, Harriet.
Thank you for listening to Conversations in Drug Development, the podcast series brought to you by the team at Bowen's. Don't forget to follow us on the usual podcast platforms or visit our website to ensure you don't miss out on any of our future episodes.